Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel, read by LMX Mabella. Chapter 7. Hermione leapt to her feet. I cannot believe you! Hermione, Draco started. A pacifying hand reached for her. His eyes were wide, the faintest glassy sheen of panic crept into them, and his face paled with worry. Good, you should be afraid, you bastard. Don't you Hermione me, you absolute prick! You lied to me! She spat as she smacked his hand away from her. Her heart hammered against her chest, a suffocating, searing pain that married perfectly with the acidic rage that was boiling in her stomach. How could you? I can't believe you. You complete ass, Draco Malfoy. The room seemed to close in on her, too small to hold all the rage she felt seeing through every fibre of her being. The last 14 months of her life, violated and manipulated by his interference. Merlin had even made her friends lie to her, hadn't he? She shook. Her hands balled into fists, and she swallowed hard to force down the nausea she felt as the last step of betrayal. Her own friends had let him do this to her. How could she have been so stupid? How long had he planning on dating her with Hermione in the dark? Despair clawed at her throat at the sudden thought that maybe he had never intended for her to find out. Maybe he had just wanted to try a relationship without any of the strings that came attached with it, and then he would simply drop her like a hot potato when he grew bored. Or perhaps even more painfully, he had used her as a practice run for when he was ready to marry a beautiful, tall, pure-blood witch, as he was no doubt expected to, as one of the heirs of the sacred 28. A sob escaped her throat, her chest seizing in protest at the image in her mind. Draco and his elegant wife standing at the altar, and Hermione drowning in paperwork at her desk, alone. Her hand grasped at the skin of her chest, trying to relieve the pressuring ache that was building, and Draco was up from the couch and in front of her in a blink of an eye. His hands cupped her cheeks gently, but firm in their comfort. Breathe, Hermione, just breathe, Draco murmured, and his forehead lowered towards hers. Hermione ripped away from him, and every betraying cell in her body screamed at her in protest. Don't touch me! She hissed and moved to stand across the room. I don't even want to look at you. You're just utterly loathsome. You complete foul. She shook her head. Save for the couch and the table between them, Hermione crossed her arms as she looked at him with utter disbelief and scorn. Did you really think you could just date me without me knowing? That I wouldn't notice? Did you really think you'd get away with it? The pain expression that had been on his face quickly blinked into an empty smirk. Hermione recognized it as the one he would use whenever he was hurt inside. I have quite successfully, Draco said, for the last 14 months or so. Funny, Hermione sneered. Only I seem to remember rejecting you on 3 separate occasions, and last I checked, a relationship requires consent from both parties. She knew it was cruel throwing it in his face, her rejections, but in that moment she didn't care. She wanted him to hurt as much as she did. Draco just smirked again, his eyes dark and glinting, like he knew exactly what she was thinking. He probably does, a treacherous voice whispered in her mind. Technically, you said no to these 3 particular dates, not me. His smug grin was insufferable. You are not getting out of this because of semantics, she said through clenched teeth. Her hair sparked, and she had to dig her fingernails into her palms as her wrist twitched towards her wand that rested on the side table. She would not give him the satisfaction of her hexing him, and him then gaining the upper ground on this. You knew damn well what I meant, Draco. Forgive me if I'm wrong, Granger, but you were the one jumping on me whenever you had the chance in the beginning, he shrugged. Awfully mixed signals for a bloke. For someone who said they didn't have the time, you certainly managed to squeeze me in. And the double entendre was not lost on her as he threw her a lascivious sneer. Some might say you even had all night long on some occasions. Hermione blushed. A betraying lick of arousal brushed at her navel as he stared at her heatedly. He lifted up a hand and started to count on his fingers. You had time for that runes exhibit, not to mention that cheeky romp in the cloakroom afterwards. You had time for the reading of that bloody book you always had your head stuck in at Hogwarts, and you had time to teach me to cook every Friday evening for a year. And you've had the time dining with both of your friends, not to mention when you're trying to not have a stroke whenever the Wonder Twins and I play a game of Quidditch. Quidditch is an insanely dangerous sport, Hermione glared at him. Draco grinned at her and tapped at his temple. Oh, I'm well aware. As a sealer, what's-her-face? He paused to throw a knowing look. Shelley, Hermione bristled and gritted her teeth, as the healer's twinkling laugh danced through her mind. Whatever, Draco dismissed, as if the encounter had been irrelevant for him. As if Hermione hadn't almost reported to healer for malpractice, her shoddy stitching charms as a result of being too busy groping Draco's thighs. As if Hermione hadn't practically given herself a stomach ulcer in her seething jealousy. And Draco hadn't even remembered the healer's name. Draco huffed out a shaky laugh and looked at her imploringly. Relationships aren't like one of your bloody proposals, Granger. Not everything needs to be so backbreaking, exhaustingly planned out and analyzed. I would like to have the option of figuring that out by my own choice, Draco, Hermione exclaimed and threw her hands in the air. Her frustration vibrated through every nerve in her body. You! She jabbed her finger towards him. You took that choice away from me. Don't you understand that? You've practically violated me by making that decision for me. How could you ever think for 1 minute that I'd be okay with that? She laughed scornfully before continuing. Oh, this is just classic old school Malfoy, isn't it? Taking whatever you want without giving a damn about someone else's feelings. I bet you probably had a right laugh about it last year when you managed to scratch know-it-all Granger's notch onto your bedpost. Don't assume you know how I feel, Granger, Draco snapped back, his expression suddenly cold and his eyes narrowed in warning. You can call me every name under the sun. Hex me if it'll bloody make you feel any better, but don't you dare undermine my feelings for you. Oh, I'm sorry, Hermione cooed. Her lips dropped into a pout as she battered her lashes. Did I cross some sort of boundary for you there? What a shame I have no idea how that feels right about now. Draco threw his hands up in the air. If his eyes were the killing curse, she was sure the ceiling would have been 6 feet under by now. What is the difference? Please explain it to me, Granger. In going to all of these events, letting your swatchy little brain soak up all the knowledge it desires, before us coming home and you fucking me stupid on a concrete bed of ours. Hermione's heart stuttered at the notion that Draco considered her flat his, their home. She swallowed dryly as Draco continued on, his own frustrations flying out of him, and Hermione wondered just how long he had been waiting for them to have this conversation. 14 months, probably, she thought bitterly. And just looking back on it, after the fact as a rather enjoyable date, why is that such an unfeasible idea for you? Draco stared hard at her. His brows furrowed together, his eyes honed in on her like a viper. Tell me, Granger, because I'm curious. Is the concept of actually dating me that's pissed you off so royally, or that you think I lied to you? You lied to me, she spat. Draco carried on as if she hadn't spoken. You're all for jumping into my lap several days of the week. You were the one to invite me round here every bloody week, for crying out loud. I held you in my arms all night whilst you cried over your cat. I watched you practically poison yourself to death with those revolting biscuits of yours, because your wonderfully stubborn backside doesn't understand the concept of a decent break. Merlin Granger, you said that you needed me. Am I supposed to just, what? Not want something more meaningful? Fuck, for fuck's sake, it's just... His hands gripped at his hair for a moment, his knuckles white and shaky before he dragged them heavily across his cheek. Is the idea of being in a relationship with me really so disturbing to you? Relationships are about trust. Every syllable fell from her lip in derision, and she glared at him in utter contempt. What, like being your emergency contact? Draco bit back without missing a beat. Or calling me when Crookshanks was ill, letting me take care of you all week after that fucking manticore savaged you? She huffed, and he threw a glare, as if daring her to argue. How about letting me set your bloody wards every night? Does none of that equate to trust? Hermione faltered, and her shoulders curved in sheepishly. She had done all of those things, hadn't she? And not once had she thought twice about it, and it was like a fresh wave of anguish over her when she realized. To her, trusting Draco Malfoy was as easy and effortless as breathing. But at that moment her lungs were full of sand dust. Draco's unwavering look smothered her, so she turned her head and watched as the pendulum rocked back and forth on the grandfather clock. She had never noticed just how grand and out of place the Malfoy antique looked next to all of her quaint, humble furniture, and she internally laughed miserably at the irony. The minute hand passed by, the ticking loud and heavy as it filled the distance between them. Hermione kept watching the clock. Draco kept watching her. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Hermione whispered eventually, when the clock signaled the new hour some 10 minutes later. Her lashes fluttered in their desperation to hold back tears. Draco was quiet for a moment longer, evidently taking the time to choose his next words carefully. "I told you, 2 years ago, Granger. I had all the time in the world to wait." She turned her head and looked at him. Despite her anger, Hermione couldn't help the way that her heart clenched at how his shoulders had drooped, and a limp, self-deprecating smile had ghosted his lips. "Since we're going down memory lane, I also remember you telling me so very aptly that my creatures were not as lucky." Draco's barked laugh was short, bitter. He looked down at his fist and scuffed his heel into the carpet. "If I'd have known how much those words were going to bite me in the arse, I would have never said them." His head tilted back up, Grey's eyes piercing and unfaltering as they met hers. "But that doesn't change the fact I'd wait forever for you, Hermione." Hermione gasped out a shaky breath, and she couldn't tell if she shook her head because of his declaration or at the gnawing demon in her chest that urged her to throw herself in his arms. Her arms tightened against her stomach in an attempt to ground herself. "That's not healthy," she couldn't help but whimper. Draco's eyes were warm with fondness, but his face was positively set with resignation as he shrugged at her. "Not the first time I've been told that." He gave no further elaboration. Hermione didn't ask. It was Draco's turn to look away, his jaw clenched. The corners of his eyes were tight, pained, and his posture was rigid. Hermione wondered if he had interpreted her concern as another rejection. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly before it quickly tightened into a fist. She couldn't escape the cloud of sorrow and guilt as memories of the same expression reeled in her mind. Every time she had called him her colleague, her co-worker, her friend. That night after her cockatrice trial when, in twisted irony, Hermione had thought that she'd almost crossed the boundaries of professionalism. She'd confessed with a slip of her tongue how relieved she was that he had returned, and had practically stumbled over herself to insist that she meant at work. How many times had Hermione unintentionally rejected him outside of his dinner invitations? How many times, whilst she had punished herself for her feelings by throwing herself into her work, he had stood by and watched her turn her back on any sort of possibility that they could be so much more? When they would make love, have sex, and Hermione felt as if his soul was intertwining with his, as her mind begged and pleaded with her to make him stay there forever, as she would tell herself the tears burning at her eyes were simply from raw pleasure, and not the way she felt utterly consumed by him, with his head buried in her neck, or when he begged her to look at him, his face open with sheer awe and unguarded pleasure. The way he had, only minutes earlier, practically spat at her when she insinuated that he didn't care for her, as if she'd greatly offended him by insulting her own naiveties. Had it all hurt him in the same way she felt in that moment? Like a part of her soul had been ripped from her. Another wave of despair washed over her, and Hermione couldn't tell if it was directed towards herself or the man standing across from her. "Don't do that," he snapped, his head whipping back to hers. His expression was pinched, anguished, and he tried to glare at her, but it lacked any real venom. "Don't look at me like I'm some ruddy piss-poor pity case, like one of your oppressed creatures. I'm not. It's not." He shook his head, and his lips pursed in a strangled wince. He sighed, and his shoulders dropped again. "I knew what I was getting myself into, Granger. Don't use that beautiful bushy head of yours to try and twist this to fit your Gryffindor martyrdom you all seem to bloody have. I knew damn well what I was doing." The room was silent as she absorbed his words for a few minutes. Why would he put so much effort into a relationship he knew couldn't be reciprocated fully? Why would he willingly give so much of himself to her when he knew Hermione wasn't available, wasn't aware that she needed to give something back? How could he lie next to her night after night, knowing that she considered him to be nothing more than a friend, at least in his mind? Her temple throbbed. Why me? Hermione couldn't hold back the question any longer. Why would he make himself suffer so much over her? Her hand cupped the softness of her stomach. She had poor eating habits. She had quite a little spiteful streak. She was stubborn. She had horrendous posture. She straightened up, and her spine groaned in response. She couldn't stand other people making decisions for her. Why not you? Draco asked back, and looked at her with a frown like she had something absurd. Her heartbeat was an untamable, erratic thumping against her chest, and she exhaled slowly, a vain attempt to call back her control against her betraying body. Hermione swallowed, her throat suddenly very dry, and quickly flicked her eyes to the out-of-place furniture, away from his eyes filled completely with an emotion Hermione didn't want to understand. The ottoman? Crookshanks had scratched and gnawed your old one to death. Rightfully so. It was hideous. Hermione shot him a look before pointing across the room. The grandfather clock. You said you needed a new one. Right, so naturally I had to have one of your family's antiques. Well, they are the best. Hermione's tongue flicked against her molars in irritation. And what about Greece? Draco snorted. I'm honestly amazed you didn't cotton on at that point, Granger. I mean, come on now. He threw her a look, his eyebrows raised in mild disbelief. My family's private villa, really? Hermione glared at him. Were you ever planning on saying something, or what? Were you just going to wait for me to clue in whilst I was walking down the aisle in some Parkinson house elf wedding gown? A Parkin what? Hermione waved her hand dismissively. Never mind. Just, were you really hoping I'd stay in the dark forever? Well, I was hoping when the third or fourth grandchild popped out, you might begin to have an inkling that something was up, Draco drawled. She had definitely sucked in oxygen way too fast, Hermione thought, when she bent over, knuckles white as they gripped at her shaking knees. She saw Draco's shoes appear in front of her, and his hands hovered barely an angel's kiss distance from her arms. Granger, fuck, that was a joke. His voice was strained. Hermione barked out a laugh of disbelief. A joke? I've known we've apparently been in a year-long relationship for less than an hour, and you're settled down enough to think about our grandchildren. She spat the last word out as she straightened up, dodging his steadying hands as she moved backwards towards the couch. She spun on her heels and rolled her eyes in a snide mocking. Let me guess, you know our children's names too? No, Draco replied quickly. Too quickly. His eyes darted to focus on the bookshelf behind her. His cheeks flushed pink. Her jaw dropped. You, she began breathlessly. You know our children's names? Her head spun, and she looked him up and down with a hesitant disdain. Please don't say it, Severus. Draco's nose crunched up in disgust. I know it's unseemly to speak ill of the dead, but who would willingly call their child that? Point to Ginny Weasley, she thought, whilst a wave of relief sagged over her, and she dropped back down on the couch, her limbs heavy. She felt utterly drained. Hermione sunk into the bed-rest of the couch and thumped at a frayed thread in between the seat cushions. Crookshanks really did ravage a lot of the furniture, as she tried to swim through the sluggish thoughts in her mind. How blind she had been! How far down in her own deep state of denial for her own feelings she must have been, to be so stupidly ignorant to what had been a glaring neon light right in front of her. It had always been there, every kiss, every morning battle with her cat, every lunchbox, and she couldn't take her eyes off of work long enough to notice the oddities of it all. I'm so stupid, she whispered, broken. Her voice was thick and watery. Ginny, Harry, Ron, even bloody Dorothy knew before I did. A shaky hand wiped away the furious tears that began to stream down her cheeks. You humiliated me. Her voice cracked at the end, and a pain-strangled wheeze sounded out from across from her. How was Hermione supposed to show her face in work, all the while knowing half of her bloody department had clued in before she had? Any time she had been in a good mood, any time she had been stressed or upset, did they all think it was because of Draco? All of those hours he spent in her office, bringing her lunch every day, she couldn't help but wonder what they must have all thought. Poor Hermione Granger, so incompetent at her own job she practically needed a babysitter. It was like her sense of self had been ripped from her skin, and she had never felt more vulnerable. Why didn't you just talk to me? Hermione pleaded with despair to the thick, heavy atmosphere of the room. She refused to look at him. Hermione wasn't sure that she could trust herself to look at him. "Would you have listened to me?" Draco sounded resigned, and Hermione cast her gaze to the floor. She envisioned modes of white paperwork around her desk, her own voice echoing in her mind from all the times she had told him she was too busy. No, she probably wouldn't have listened to him, she swallowed bitterly. Draco kneeled before her, his eyes wild with pleading desperation. "Hermione," he said quietly, as a placating thumb traced circles on her knee. And she didn't know if it was the way he said her name, or maybe if the thought had slowly slithered its way to the front of her mind. But her name in silken navy blue flashed in her memory. "Theo and Pansy, they know everything, don't they?" Draco didn't answer her, but Hermione hadn't needed him to, and she felt the acidic nausea of humiliation burn within her again. Her anger like a rejuvenation potion, Hermione leapt back to her feet and glared down at Draco, still on his knees, with as much venom as she could muster. "I bet that must have been really entertaining for the three of you when we sat with them for those dinners," she said with a bitter drawl. "Poor stupid swotty Granger, too busy blabbering away about protecting her beasts, and she can't even see what's right in front of her. Not much faith for the Wizengamot, is it? Oh, no wonder she needs our precious pureblood money." Draco stood back up and stepped in close, dangerously close to her. He inhaled, and she quivered as his chest brushed against hers, the fury in her stomach smothered by that little demon that begged her to close the distance between them. Hermione had to stare at their feet as not to let her eyes flutter shut as the intoxicating scent of apples and cedar would seductively weave through her senses. "I told you before, Granger, it's not like that." He reached up to play with her hair. She didn't know why she let him. A hand glided through her curls, and he stared at his fingers as if mesmerized. "It's like you're in my skin, Granger," he confessed. "You've got me wrapped around your little finger." He twisted a curl around his finger and watched, entranced, as it sprung back into place when he let it go. Her face burned as she felt his searing grey eyes glide over her features. A gentle tuck of her hair, and then one of his hands cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a leftover tear. "Say you'll be mine, Hermione." His voice was barely above a whisper, and his forehead leaned down to rest against hers. His nose nudged her softly, and her heart positively wept. "We can be so good together, baby, please. You can be mad at me for as long as you want, as long as you need. Please, just give us a chance." His other hand reached to tilt up her chin, Hermione's chest sinking into his. Every fragment of her muscles melted into his embrace when he leaned in. His lips brushed against hers. "Stop! No, just stop!" Hermione gasped as she ripped herself out of his arms again. Her nerves were raw and frayed as she stared at him with wide eyes. "You can't just say those things and then kiss me and expect everything to be okay. Draco, you can't." Hermione shook her head, and then again, and then once more. You can't." Her throat closed over on a sob, and she held out her hand in defense as Draco pleadingly reached for her. What you've done." She shook her head at him again, and his pained, agonized face was blurry through her tears. How could Draco think that she could stand to kiss him at that moment? Every nerve in her body felt exposed, stripped raw, and clawed at. Hermione felt like her chest was being crushed, precious memories of their innocent outings tainted and violated by the fact that it had all been carefully and cunningly orchestrated by slippery fingers. And then it was like her anguished fury forcefully burst its way through the smog of betrayal and heartbreak, and words fell from her lips like she had no control. "You've humiliated me. You've lied to me. You've made my friends lie to me. You've manipulated everything to fit into your plans. What about my plans, Draco? What about what I want with my life?" Her voice was louder now, and she vibrated with rage. "You took one look at me from the most superficial layer and decided you thought you knew what was best for me and what I would want. Well, guess what, Malfoy? You don't!" "Hermione." Draco's expression was shattered, and his breath ragged and thin. He looked like he'd just had his heart ripped out of his chest, his soul sucked out of him. And just for a moment, Hermione felt it, and her mind screamed at her to take everything she just said back, to bury herself back into the comfort and safety of his embrace and just live there forever. The ugly, raging demon within her seemingly evaporated, and she gasped painfully at the sudden, stricken wave of regret that spiked every cell in her body. Her arms wrapped around and constricted themselves around her waist in an attempt to smother the conflicting emotions inside of her. She wanted him to stay. She wanted him to leave. She wanted to kiss away every inch of agony on his face. She wanted him to grovel on his knees. She wanted to wake up the next day to the sound of Draco fighting her cat for some toast. She never wanted to see his beautiful face again. She wanted him to stay. She wanted him complaining in their concrete bed with his arms around her waist as she snuggled into his warmth. She wanted him to stay. Her tongue wet her lips. "I think you should go," she whispered. "Hermione." Draco's legs twitched as if he had to physically restrain himself. "If you don't, I'm going to say something I'll regret, and I don't want to do that to you." She couldn't look at him, and turned to look back at the grandfather clock again. She heard Draco swallow dryly, and her eyes clenched shut as he slowly approached her. Her skin hummed as Draco's lips met her cheeks in a delicate kiss. "I'm only of an hour away," he murmured next to her ear. With a final brush of his nose against the edge of her jaw, he stepped away, and Hermione could breathe again. Hermione stared into the fireplace long after the flames had died down, and the stench of burning ashes no longer clung to the air. The moon was high by the time Hermione had the energy to move again, and as she made her way to her bedroom, she had almost convinced herself that the tears that streamed down her face again was nothing more than irritation from the flu ash. And then he had the gall to actually try to kiss me. Can you believe that imprudent git? As if that was going to somehow take back everything that he's done. Ha! Hermione huffed and leaned back into her chair, which creaked unnervingly. The ministry cafeteria really needed to upgrade their furniture. Her cheeks were hot and prickly, and Hermione had to take several deep inhales. She hadn't realized how long she had been renting for, and her vision had grown alarmingly spotty in the last few minutes of her recanting the previous night to her closest friends. Harry and Ron looked at her, waiting for her to continue. She flicked her brows and bit back an eyebrow as she said, "I'm finished." "You also said that 15 minutes ago," Ron said, his voice distorted and echoey as he broke off into a yawn. He straightened up, his face brightening as he turned to grin smugly at Harry. "Pay up, Potter." Hermione frowned as she watched Ron's fingers clap against his open palm expectantly, and Harry reached into his pocket with a grumble. Her jaw dropped as Harry placed a couple of galleons into Ron's hand, the latter pocketing them with a gloating "Cheers." "Did you bet on me?" Hermione spluttered and glared at the two of them accusingly. Harry at least had the decency to flush under her expression, and took great interest in studying the leftover piece on his plate. Ron just shrugged at her. "We had nothing else to do but wait for you to clock on. Might as well make some money out of it." Hermione bristled and static stung at the nape of her neck. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "Is that so?" "We don't get mad at us, at least not just us. There's a whole pool going on with a few other employees." Ron gestured vaguely to the other tables before he turned and whispered to her conspiratorially. "Can you pretend to be in the dark for one more month? That'd give me a solid 100 gallons. Come on, I'll split my winnings with you, and you can go and see that Blossom Brune blokes you like." "Blishin," Hermione corrected through gritted teeth. "You made a bet?" "We did." Ron nudged Harry under the table, who looked very much like a man who would rather be faced with Voldemort again at that moment. "About me," Ron hummed. "With our colleagues." "You're making it sound like we got the whole bloody department involved." Ron rolled his eyes. "I don't want to kick you whilst you're down on nothing, Miney, but your math weren't exactly subtle. You'd think for someone as bright as yourself, you'd remember the silencing charm every once in a while." All three of them looked uncomfortable at his implications. Hermione was positive her face had turned a violent fuchsia, and Harry coughed pointedly. "Hermione, did you really never had any suspicions?" He peered at her from beneath his glasses with a small frown that married his eyebrows together. "You mean, did I ever have any suspicions when a co-worker invited me to work-related events?" Hermione rolled her eyes. "Gee, let me think about that, Harry." He's had dinner at my house, Harry pointed out dryly and snorted. Imagine telling yourself that 5 years ago, Ron muttered, the pair of them ignoring him. Yes, to which we bring our case files over from work and finish them whilst you and Ginny try not to blow up your kitchen. You play quidditch with us once a month, Ron added. I mean, really, that should have clued you in months ago. I don't care about quidditch, Hermione snapped back. Her stomach swooped in bitter anger at the realization that Ron had a point. Even if Draco and their childhood friends had grown to be cordial with one another, that certainly was enough of a reason for him to willingly spend time with them and engage in some light-hearted competition. Hermione remembered with a jolt that Draco and Ron had actually high-fived one another one time after they won against Harry's team. They had bantered with each other all afternoon like they had bonded. Bonded over her. Merlin surely had been blind to it all. You were Malfoy's jersey when you watched us play, Ron grimaced, likely at the thought of Hermione willingly wearing Slytherin colours. Well, it gets cold just standing there for hours. A warming charm not enough for you? Harry ducked to rub invisible dirt out of his glasses, his shoulders shaking in restrained laughter as Hermione threw him a dirty skull. Hermione, you practically have a panic attack any time a bludger flies within 5 feet of him, Ron said as he reached for a plate and stole the last bite of his steak and kidney pie. They can cause severe concussions, Hermione scolded him hotly. Ron cocked a brow as he chewed. Yeah, I know. Happened to me last time. Took you an hour after the match to notice, by the way. I only have one pair of eyes, Ronald. Yeah, and they're always on Malfoy. Hermione's lip jutted out as she sulked, her arms crossed under her chest. Why are you two defending him? And don't think I've forgotten that you two hid this from me as well. But Draco, he took advantage of me. Harry's head snapped to hers, and his eyes blazed furiously. You're saying Malfoy forced you? Hermione's hand darted out to grab his arms, Harry already halfway out of his seat, no doubt with every intention of storming into Draco's office and dragging him out by his silky roots. She felt a rush of cold anxiety run through her as the implications of what she had said hit her. No, Merlin, no, not like that, Hermione gasped. She waited as Harry sagged with relief and slowly sunk back into his chair before she continued. I meant like tricking me into going on dates. Draco would never hurt me, Harry. At least no more than he already had. Hermione swallowed back the sob in her throat as her hand rubbed at the ache in her breastbone. Hermione, when you say he tricked you, Ron frowned at her, you mean you had some free time, Malfoy invited you to do something, and you agreed to it? He never told me it was for a date, Hermione hissed. I get that, but, I mean, come on, Grease, Hermione, really? Ron stared at her and mocked aghast. If you're comfortable enough to spend 4 days away in a private villa with one of your co-workers, then maybe I'm in the wrong department. I mean, really, he snorted and tittered at her. They're going to strip you of your brightest witch of her age title for that one. Harry shot him a warning look when Hermione sneered at him, his green eyes kind and open as he turned back to her. Believe me when I say I really don't want to ask this, Hermione. Harry did look a vile shade of peaky green, and he grimaced. But these not dates. I mean, after the date was over, did you two? How often did he end up spending the night? Oh, bloody hell! Ron groaned and looked over away to take a great interest in observing the food stains on the cafeteria floor. Seemingly hundreds of nights of hot gasps and slicked skin against her flitted across her eyes, and Harry held up both hands defensively. I'm not judging you or anything, Hermione, but, well, it's not like you exactly drove him away, did you? Sex does not mean I consented to dating, she barked back, a little too loudly, judging by the scandalized looks from a pair of senior witches sat at the table next to theirs. Hermione flushed. She was pretty sure she recognized one of them from the chambers. I'm not saying that it does, Harry said calmly. My point being, it seemed like you rather enjoyed hanging out with Malfoy, and yes, I know you thought it was for work, he added on quickly as Hermione opened her mouth in rebuttal. But you still enjoyed it enough to repeat it regularly as well as other activities. Harry coughed awkwardly, his ears bloodshot red. I know you think you don't have the time, and I'm not saying that it's not true. But you do have some spare time, and it seems to me that Malfoy knew how to deal with that perfectly. I mean, it's taken you over a year to notice, so surely your work, socializing, get-togethers are kind of effortless. Not everything needs to be so backbreaking, exhaustingly planned out and analyzed. Hermione's eyes squeezed shut as Draco's strained, exhausted voice sounded in her mind. She felt another step of anger as she thought about Draco's hypocritical words. How dare he try to lecture her on relationships whilst he had spent over a year carefully and tactfully orchestrating their dates, just casual enough that Hermione wouldn't notice the veil of deceit behind his invitations, and just wonderful enough that Hermione would take him up on his offer time and time again. Hermione, you can't tell me that in all the time you've spent around Malfoy, you've never, not even once, thought about dating him? Harry asked, and she cursed him for knowing her so well. Every time he brought her lunch and she saw that beautiful private grin of his whenever she tucked into it greedily. Every night when he kissed her neck. Every time she would come back from a meeting and a stack of paperwork that she hadn't managed to look at had somehow mysteriously travelled to Draco's desk, which he would be going through ardently, and what had shocked her, the first few times he had done it, he wouldn't even mention it. The first time they decided to be a little adventurous in the shower and Draco had accidentally gotten shampoo in her eyes. The way he had hovered over her all day afterwards, apologetic kisses pressed to any inch of the skin that he could see. How he would peacock whenever he won at their quidditch matches, and Hermione would congratulate him for not getting bludgeoned to death. She had let herself pretend just for a moment that they had been that little something more than co-workers and friends. And then she would remember the stack of cases, backlogged by at least 2 months, that Hermione wasn't even close to going through, and those thoughts would be dragged to the very depth of the back of her mind, snuffed out and locked up tight, until she would wake up the next day in his arms to a soft kiss at the back of her neck. Her nose tingled as she felt tears bloom in the corner of her eyes. Of course I have, she confessed quietly, unsure if the pair had even heard her over the bustling sound of their luncheoning colleagues. It's the fact that he lied to me. I trusted him, and he threw it back in my face. She wiped away at the tears that had treacherously begun to fall. Draco knew, you both knew, Jenny knew. Merlin, thanks to your bloody bed, it seems like half the ministry knew. I feel so humiliated. Her voice wobbled, and she buried her face in her hands as she sobbed. She felt each of their hands come up to rub at her shoulders soothingly, and she whimpered. How can I just forgive him? Hermione said thickly, and shook her head behind her hands. How can I just be expected to move on and forgive him when it feels like I'm suffocating? The air at the table was thick and heavy with silence. Hermione, do you remember that boat trucker case a few years back? Ron asked eventually. When he had tried to stop that ministry excavation from being carried out? How it would have meant hundreds of thousands of boat truckers would have been wiped out. Hermione looked at him, her stomach tight with trepidation. Of course I do. It had been her first major bill to be presented to the Wisingamot, and she had lost. Ron nodded. Do you remember completely breaking down outside the chambers? How Harry and I had to be the ones to escort you to St. Mungo's? Hermione's eyes cast down on the table. The three of them had promised to never talk about that again. How she'd woken up confused and terrified to see healers and medewitches in lime green robes. It had taken her 3 days to convince them she was of sound mind. She had refused to speak with Harry and Ron for 2 weeks afterwards until she'd realized how equally traumatic the ordeal had to have been for them to see her like that. And she'd stormed the aura department, entirely thrown herself into their alarmed but relieved embraces. Harry nodded in agreement with Ron. Hermione, you're brilliant, and I would defend you on that down to my last knap. But let's be honest, it seemed like every few months I was being summoned to a department because it collapsed from exhaustion and needed an escort home. Face it, Hermione, you don't exactly handle your stress well. Ron leaned against the backrest of his chair with his heavy exhale. As much as it pains me to say, and don't ever tell him I taught you this, but Malfoy, he's been good for you. It's like he knows when to pull you back, when you're on the brink of losing it again. I know you're swamped, and I know you think you don't have a second moment to spare. But have you even taken a moment to look at your pass rate this last year? I mean, sure, the Wizengamot had buggered you royally with those manticores, but other than that, you've been on a winning streak. And I'm not saying that Malfoy is the reason for that. You winning those cases all comes down to your hard work and dedication to your job. But if Malfoy hadn't stepped in when he did, helping you with your cases, making sure you ate, just taking care of you, who's to say that your next case wouldn't have been your last? What help are you to the creatures you care so bloody deeply about if the next time you had an episode, what if you weren't as lucky? What if it meant you were forced to become a permanent resident at St. Mungo's? Harry and Ron's face twinned with pinched anguish, and Hermione's chest burned with guilt. It seemed like it wasn't just Draco who held back his feelings. It wasn't that bad, Hermione said weakly. Harry huffed out a weak laugh. Hermione, before Malfoy started joining your cases regularly, you were almost 2 stone underweight, and how many hours of sleep would you get on average? 3? 4 on a good day? We all know you're meant to be Minister for Magic one day, Hermione, Ron checked on, and smiled when she flushed. Don't take yourself out of the running before you even had your shot, just because you don't know how to take care of yourself, even if that means having Malfoy be the one at your side to hold you steady. Hermione couldn't hold back her look of betrayal at her ex-boyfriend. I can't believe you, of all people, don't have a problem with that. Ron shrugged and took a moment to have a sip of his coffee. Judging by his faint wince of disgust, it had probably long gone cold. I'm 26 now, Hermione. Figured I should at least have the emotional range of a soup spoon, you know. He winked at her, and Hermione snorted. The action quickly evolved into a full-blown laughter as Harry joined in. Look, Hermione, Harry said as their laughter trickled down. As your best friend, if we thought Malfoy was being malicious or could hurt you, or had bad intentions in any way, don't you think we would have stepped in? Do you really believe we would have just stood by and let him do that to you? Harry's eyes were hurt and tight, and Hermione felt shame curl up in her stomach. She hadn't thought about it like that. As her best friends, of course they would have had their best interests in their hearts, and whilst they were cordial with Draco to an extent, did Hermione really believe deep down that they would have chosen his side over hers? Her shoulders curved in sheepishly. I meant what I said on the bonfire night, Hermione, Harry interrupted her quiet musings. I've never seen you so happy. Hermione quirked a brow. I made our receptionist cry just a few weeks ago. Yes, but she's not going to spend her summer locked up in a jar. I'd call it progress, Harry grinned. The bustling around them dimmed, the lunch hour effectively drawing to a close as dozens of ministry employees left the cafeteria to rush back to their desks. As if on cue, Hermione's own wand buzzed against the table. For what it's worth, Hermione, Ron said as she slipped her wand back into her robes. What stopped me from ever saying anything wasn't because of Malfoy or the way he was with you. It was you. Hermione's brows furrowed as she tilted her head in confusion. Ron smiled at her, boyish, yet bittersweet, and her chest warmed with fondness. He looked so much like his teenage self when he smiled. It was the way you looked at him, Hermione. In the years you and I dated, you never once looked at me the way you look at Malfoy. The lift doors shuddered open with a groan as Hermione arrived back to her floor. She sluggishly stepped into the corridor. Her soul weighed down on her heavily as she thought about what Ron had said right before she left, and every step felt like a marathon. Hermione needed to get back to her desk. She needed to stop thinking about this mess with Draco. She needed the stacks of white paperwork and her memos and her to-do list. Wait, no, Draco had made that for her. She wouldn't use it. She didn't want him thinking for one moment that she still needed him. The preposterous notion that, in any way, she couldn't do her job as a professional functioning witch without him. Her heart slammed to a halt against her ribcage when she spotted Draco stood by the reception desk, passing some folder to Matilda. He looked awful. Even from a short distance away she could tell by the way his shoulders curved inwards, his slouched stance almost undetectable, the shocking mass of blonde hair that could give Harry's a run for his money, and she could see the faintest bruising under his eyes. And Hermione knew, like herself, that he hadn't slept. Hermione didn't feel as happy about that as she thought she would. As if sensing her presence, and maybe he did, Draco went rigid, and her palms were dumb with anticipation as his head slowly turned to hers. She couldn't help the shaky exhale as his eyes, closed off and empty, met hers. Ron's final word to her before she had left their lunch table echoed in her mind, and Hermione quickly looked away. She had no idea how she looked at Draco, as Ron had put it, but she knew that she didn't want him to see it anyway. Hermione breathed in deeply and pulled her shoulders back. Her eyes focused on her office door at the end of the corridor. Hermione moved quickly past the reception desk, and she felt mildly guilty at the way she blanked the poor receptionist's greeting. Her steps aggressively thumped against the floor. She could have sworn she felt long, elegant fingers brush against her back when she passed them, and Hermione sucked in the air harshly. "Laura," she said when her office door was only yards away from her, and Hermione was very relieved when her voice didn't betray a single tremor. "How many meetings do I have this afternoon?"
"Two, Miss Granger, with the respective goblin and the banker from your March complaint file."
Hermione waited until she had crossed over the safety threshold of her office before she turned around and looked back to where she still felt eyes on her from the reception desk. Draco's face was neutral, expressionless, and she felt a stab of bitter anger at how easy it was for him to appear so unaffected. A small, twisted, and vicious part of her wanted him to look as wrecked as she felt. Hermione pointedly held his gaze as she spoke, her voice loud and projected to the entire corridor, despite her assistant only being set 2 feet from here. "Make sure it stays just those 2 meetings. There's nobody else worth my time today." As Hermione turned back into her office with the door slammed behind her, she thought about the way Draco winced minutely at her words, and how she didn't feel a single lick of satisfaction from it. She didn't feel good at all. Hermione led Crookshanks into her bedroom that night. She basked in the comfort of another being in her 2 empty bed for barely 10 minutes before her familiar realized that Draco would not be joining them again. She gulped at the look of utter betrayal Crookshanks threw her way before it gingerly leaped from the bed and sulked back into the corridor. A few moments later she heard his paw scratch at the gate of the fireplace, a distraught and confused whine as he called out for the wizard. She kicked off her sheets with a huff and stormed across her bedroom to slam her door shut, bitterly. "Little backstabber," she grumbled, and turned on her heel. Hermione cursed as she tripped, her foot caught in. She froze as she looked down at Draco's Quidditch jersey that had somehow wrapped itself around her foot without her noticing. Well, wasn't that poetic? She bent down and carefully freed her foot, before making her way to sit on the edge of her bed. Draco's jersey was still in her hands. She couldn't bring herself to let it go. She glanced mournfully behind her. Her sheets looked depressingly empty and cold. Hermione let out a shaky exhale as she laid back down and turned on her side with the jersey curled into her chest. She finally drifted off to sleep some hours later, breathing in apples and cedarwood. Tears dried against her cheeks as she had tried to imagine Draco's arm wrapped tightly around her waist.
Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Elmix Marbella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.